Hey everyone, it's Paula MacLean and we're back with the next module in the Great Boards video course. And this module's talking about how we actually create governance policies. So we talked a lot in previous modules about the importance of governance policies, what they do, how they help create relationship, how they, prevent misunderstandings, how they, stop us from getting into trouble in terms of who does what, how they help guide the board in creating the foundation under the organization and lead to the organization's success. So we're going to talk in this module then in a deep dive way with several lessons about governance policies, what they are, how we create them, and I'm going to actually give you a governance policy template that you can work with and adjust to meet your own organization's needs. So let's just start with kind of a definition of what is governance. It's a word that we use a lot, but it doesn't really kind of connote, it's not a word that we use a lot in just normal English spoken language, and so it doesn't connote really anything to us until we kind of understand what we actually mean by it. So governance is the process that nonprofit boards use to manage themselves and also to provide stewardship and oversight to the organization as a whole. So self-management and stewardship of the organization are the two components of governance. So let's just move to the whole idea of what are governance policies. So we all know that managers need operational policies to ensure that services operate properly, that employees are well treated, that human resources are managed effectively, that facilities are maintained, that finances are well managed and accounted for. So that's what operational policies do. And for the same reason, the board needs governance policies to ensure the efficient and the effective operations of the board and to ensure those are consistent over time. One of the unique qualities of boards is that there are new members joining the board, or should be new members joining the board each year. And when we do board succession planning, about a third of the board should be in its first year. Members should be in their first year of service, but a third of the board are in their second or third year of service, and a third of the board will be rotating off because they have completed either their term or terms of service. So when we think about consistency and the importance of policies from that perspective, we would really have chaos if we are losing a third of our board every year and then we just didn't have anything that kind of shore us up and give us the structure and help us understand what the expectations were. So governance policies are a very important part of creating consistent board practices over time. So governance policies obviously have to be in writing, and they also need to be approved by a board motion. The policies are usually developed as we need them, but it's a good thing if we collect them all up and put them in one place, and you can call that your board governance policy manual. And in practice, it's actually better to create a committee, a group of people who will sit around a table for a few months and actually create the policies as a whole. The problem is that if we just let the policies stay resident in our board meeting minutes, sometimes they get lost, sometimes they get forgotten. They're for sure not very accessible. So my preference is that you can collect up everything by way of board policies that you created to date, but then create a governance policy manual and then follow the template that I'm going to share with you that will give you the overall structure that you need to be able to have a comprehensive set of board governance policies. Now, policies are the what, so they're the kind of the bigger picture, needs to be followed, and procedures, sometimes we call them practices, they are the how. So we need both in the governance policy manual. If the governance policies are too big, they're not specific enough. So it might say, the executive director is limited to signing authority of $5,000 of budgeted expenses or less. And so that's not an uncommon policy to limit the executive director signing authority. However, the question is, how do we actually implement that? So we need some practices or some procedures that are subordinate to that, that give further clarification and further direction. And there are very few policies that don't need procedures or practices, kind of the sub-points of the how underneath them. Once the policies are approved by the board. They are binding on the board. So we can't just ignore the policies or treat them as inconvenient if we have something that doesn't fit. Now, a few years ago, I worked with an organization who was doing some review of the practices of the organization as a result of receiving a grievance letter to the board. The person had followed the appropriate grievance procedures. The grievance letter was quite strong, and I think the board was a little bit offended by some of the things that were said in the letter. That led to a fairly heated conversation and a decision made by the board, not by a motion, but by consensus, that they would not respond to the grievance letter. Well, here's the problem with that. When I challenged them, they asked me to come in and do some facilitation around the conflict that ensued. And when I challenged the board and said, why did you decide not to respond to the grievance letter? And the answer was, we're the board. We can do anything we want. I said, but you actually have a grievance policy, which this in particular employee followed. And I said, so you have an obligation to respond in your policy. Well, but we can change the policy. Well, yes, they can, but no, they didn't. And in this case, no, they also shouldn't. So it was a good example of the board saying a little bit presumptuously, we're the ultimate authority and we get to say or do anything we want, including not following our own rules. So when you think about the word bylaw, think about your constitutional document inside your organization. You think, you know that's a legal document. You know that you have to follow your own bylaws. By the way, lots of boards also choose to ignore some of their bylaws, which is not very good practice either. But the same thing is true of governance policies. Once they are created, they are like a law, and you're obliged to follow them. If you don't want to follow them, you certainly can change them. A board motion can change any of your governance policies as long as that motion is approved by the majority of the board. So we can change them, but we can't ignore them. And if a policy is not clear, the best thing that you can do is to reword it. And I really like the concept of continuous improvement when it comes to governance policies. So rather than just have a committee every 3 years review your governance policies and make any changes, which is still a good idea, when you find a policy that's not clear, that's troublesome, that isn't got the right wording, or maybe the policy is pretty good, but you left out a procedure and that needs to be clarified, just make sure that you create a board motion to approve whatever you need to change. Change it on the electronic copy, and I'll talk a little bit more about where you should keep copies of this document. And make sure that if you have paper copies circulating, that there's a note to the paper copy that says this is changed. Don't reprint the entire document. If you want to reprint a page, if it has had minimal impact, that's fine. What I prefer on paper documents is to say, please refer to policy amendment. You can handwrite this if you want to, and then reprint the document once every year, 6 months to a year. Just put, please refer to amendment and electronic copy, and then keep your electronic copies on a common drive somewhere that the board and senior managers have access to. So very important then that we keep on this whole business of keeping the document updated and really practice continuous improvement of our policies as going forward. That's the end of our first lesson. Please continue on to the next lesson.